Welcome to Windows on the World. Welcome to the live stream. And tonight we're going to have a follow-on show from the live streams we've been doing in the past couple of weeks. And that includes real-time revelations and future shock. Future shock was this idea that things are moving so fast, it's difficult for people to keep up. There was a lecture given by a Dr. Richard Day in 1969 at Mount Sinai Hospital, and it's referred to as the Order of New Barbarians. And he said that people would really struggle to keep up with the changes that were coming. That was in 1969. Well, what we seem to have is change, sudden and rapid change, but a lot of repetition. And that's not just what's happening globally with the expansion of the globalist plan, which is, of course, sustainable development, which means and includes wars and all sorts of land grabs everywhere. Those are all sustainable, you see, if you're the World Bank and its chosen partners and the favored corporations and, of course, the stakeholders. So we have talked about whether this is actually sustainable and what the purpose of it all is, because it's not really going to end in a greater civilization. It's actually going to degenerate civilization, and that's actually what's been happening. So we've got a degenerated civilization, and we've got a lot of repetition, and that's going to be the yes, just checking I'm on. That's going to be the major subject of tonight's show, along with other things. So we're talking about the highest system of governance and the perfection of higher vocation and knowledge. And I think that's really important because we're in a time where we've got a degeneration of knowledge. For instance, I routinely get sent videos and information, and those videos and that information that I receive are really the sort of thing that goes nowhere. In other words, they talk constantly about the problem. They talk about the two lies, for and against. They never talk about the cause and the solution. So what they talk about is this problem that is created, and it can be mass immigration, it can be the latest killings, it can be all of these things which are degenerating society. But unless we have an overview, it's fragmented and it will never go anywhere. For instance, I received a video today which was based along the lines of the comedy character Common Law Malcolm. And his catchphrase is winning, winning, because he uses methods which not only do not work, but actually cause more trouble than if he hadn't have actually tried to react against the system. And we've covered this on many previous shows, and it goes back about 20 years. But I was dismayed to find out that there is a sort of new version and many new versions of this sort of character who are still thinking that the ancient past and the common law of the ancient past is somehow relevant now. Well, it is in some ways, but in many ways it isn't. And the ways in which it is relevant are not the ways that these people are actually trying to use them within the system. So this is very dismaying, because when you've actually been around these people, maybe talked to them, showed them information, and put it out in many shows which they've listened to, and they still go back to this default position, that's what I'm really talking about. This is a degeneration of the mind, and it's something I think that's very, very important. It all comes down to algorithms, how we are pushed into looking at certain information, and the solution to that is to escape the predictor. So in other words, we are being herded. It's a crowd elite system, and we are being herded. The algorithm input and output is defined by a set of rules. And how do we move forward with information? Well, to move forward with information, information has to be received, then it has to be acted upon in an effective way, and then integrated practically into a system of knowledge. And that is what is not happening. So in other words, people will look for a template solution to something which there is no template solution for, because the template solution has already been taken account of by the algorithm or the predictor. So this is something that I actually got fed up of talking about, because years ago I was doing all this sort of stuff in courts, and you had times when you get successes and major things did happen. I may do a show on that, because I did a show about birth certificates, trusts, and competence. And people did find that quite useful. But because there's so much misinformation in this particular field, then it just gets into a whole area where people lump it in with all sorts of things. So people can be talking about things that aren't connected and then not focusing on the major issue. And that is the most important thing. So step-by-step process basically is what's needed. And input defined and output is predicted. So if your input is being defined and looked at and the outcome is predicted, then you're in this algorithmic. It could be a mind gulag, it could be a thought group, like an egregorial thought group. And that seems to be what has happened. And that happened very fast after the COVID agenda. That happened really fast after that. And I called it a fork in the road because that's what it was. But it was a fork in the road on so many different levels. And really, we should be talking when we're looking at this, uh, the difference here between mind and mindset. So mind is an open field. Mind is an open field which can be in contact with higher sources. Mindset, however, is a set of beliefs which control input, response, and behavior. In other words, the mindset predicts outcomes. So once you predict somebody's mindset, you can steer them into the intended outcome, which is what the communitarian global system of governance, the soft governance, which is outside of national governance, which is implemented pretty much in every country and to slightly different degrees, then once you understand this, then you can get beyond it. Unless you understand it, you can't get beyond it. So unless you can be an individual mind which can act collectively, then you cannot find solutions within the present system because everybody and everything is steered into the same direction. And people obviously know this through interaction with their councils. We've done so many shows on this about how consensus is arrived at through steering people into the already predicted and intended outcome. And people say, well, we went there, but we didn't have a choice. How many times do you have to keep saying that? There have to be countermeasures. And that's where real initiative comes in. And I think that's where the fun can be had, because I think this can be educational and fun dealing with these impositions of governance. So just a few opening thoughts there. And I made quite a few notes for this tonight, but I think it's a very important thing. And we did touch on it in the last but one live stream. And it's such an important issue. So we'll get into algorithms now. Once algorithm or the accepted corridor of opinion is implanted into the field of information, it influences the individual. And low level of information into the allowed algorithms has degenerated mindsets all over the world. So in other words, you have to step outside this. There is no point watching and doing the same thing over and over again. People are 95% visual, so they do like to see people talking to them. And I get a lot of these videos sent to me of somebody talking. And the whole idea of what I'm doing here is that I'm not just talking, I'm relaying sections of information which will prove useful. In other words, it's like a practical toolkit. And that's the way I find learning really is effective. So that's the purpose of these. But what I get is people sending me stuff that is of no use whatsoever. And this has multiplied and multiplied and multiplied until now we've got people just setting channels up for talking about Tommy Robinson and when's he going to get out of prison, or got people just talking constantly about mass immigration. Now, these are outcomes of the global predictor. They are nothing to do with just one aspect which people sort of hone in on. They concentrate on this, but they never see the bigger picture. And that's been the problem that I've had with all media over the past 10 to 15 years. And of course, the alternative media became the corporate alternative media. And it's all the same. So basically, there is a lot of content without content. So, yes, low level of information into the predicted and allowed algorithms has degenerated mindset all over the world. Intelligence rules mind function. Lack of intellect leads to a lack of effective self-governance. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we must, if we are to progress, be able to find sources which are of a higher value and higher content value than what is actually given to us in algorithms. So anything that is pushed your way, unless it's part of an algorithm where you've been looking for certain things and something else crops up, which I think is quite useful with the internet because it leads you on to other things. But mainly people are stuck into watching the same thing over and over again. And I get sent the same thing every day. And that is why I don't have anything to do with social media anymore, because it's just pointless. It's not achieving anything. And there are no worthwhile outcomes. And how long can you go on with that until you actually do get worthwhile outcomes? So this all goes into the idea of global citizens. So if you're in any sort of algorithm, you're a product of simple algorithmic programming, and you're given a false worldview, which is based on the most simple of deceptions. And this is kind of layer one, really, to get past these most simple deceptions. Whereas people who get past some of the simple deceptions, then they just get trapped into these thought groups. And I think this is such an important thing at the present time because it's stagnated just about everything. And it's something that's not really talked about because, of course, so many people now want to become commentators on something they know absolutely nothing about. And yes, global citizens serve a corporate run system of government, and they can be for or against the agenda. Remember, the globalists need the anti-globalists to implement their policies. So they steer the anti-globalists into the policies of the globalists. And so anybody who knows a little bit about governance and the way games operate should know this. And a lot of people do know this, but if you're stuck and sucked into this algorithm, then you will never get out of it. And this, I know I'm sort of talking about this quite a lot, but I find it really appalling because there's people I knew from 10 years ago who have gone backwards. They've not gone forwards. There was a point where information seemed to be going forward before the COVID agenda. And now it seems to have gone backwards. Of course, not to the listeners to this show, because the people who listen to this are generally not following these algorithms. But we can all get sucked into it if we're not careful. So, yes, basically, people are making matters worse, and not only for themselves, for everyone else. And I'm going to quote to you now from a show we did called Archons of Community. And I went back to talk about the archons, which can be magistrates or rulers. That's the original use of the word archon from the Nag Hammadi texts. And a lot of people use this word now, and it's become part of the sort of alternative New Age scene. And I don't see it as part of that at all. Archon just means ruler or magistrate, and it can refer to a ruling, governing body. So this show is called Archons of Community. Again, going back to where these solutions really are, locally on your doorstep, not at the World Economic Forum, not at Davos, and not in the talking shops of the online grifters. The solutions to everything to do with what you are concerned about are on your doorstep in your local town hall. I know I've been talking about it a long time, but for people who've just jumped on, as they say, well, go back in the archive and look up articles which go back to big society change agents from 20, 12, I think that was, republished again in 2014. But I wrote as an introduction to this article, many listen, but few understand. This is the story of the current age. Too much information and not enough knowledge. An already corrupted and easily steered population who are being pushed into the intended outcome. And it doesn't matter whether that's willingly or unwillingly, they still go in the same direction. And that is the dichotomy, because what interrupts the algorithm? An unexpected action which is based on factual knowledge, which has a predicted outcome, which is in itself effective. And that's all there is to it. So, in other words, people have been steered into wasting their time down numerous dead ends and arguing over issues of absolutely no importance. So, after the COVID agenda, the mindset was further destabilized and degeneration, as we said, has increased. Some believe they had woken up in some way and followed promoted information, promoted protests, and this led to a number of mind traps in these organized so-called protest groups, which was steered from day one in a communitarian way. So this steering, as in big society, as in what George Soros does, the whole of this fake revolutionary spirit, which has harnessed people, is one of the most important things to get people out of. Because if they are being told what they think they want to hear, they see nothing wrong with it. They do not understand counterintelligence, which is steering them, telling them 60% of what they want to hear and introducing maybe 40% of stuff, which is going to take them into the predicted cul-de-sac. And that is why I gave up on these groups, because the only group that's going to actually be of use is a group that you can form, which has a cell of 2 to 3 people who are absolutely known to each other, because the infiltration of everything through a communitarian system is absolute. So you don't need real troublemakers to come in anymore, which is what happened years ago. You just have these set up groups and people join them. So they will spend all their days on Telegram in these groups, and people have even got arrested for posting their opinions in there. This is so counterproductive as to be almost, well, it makes, let's put it this way, it makes common law Malcolm look like he is really winning. It's incredible to me. And some people have got into really serious trouble over posting opinions. Why did they need to do that? To tell the people who already know how they feel, how they feel. Wouldn't that be better to be energized, that effort energized into an intended outcome? And of course, that's where things can face real opposition, because if you actually start doing something, say locally, and it becomes quite effective, there will be not only attempts at infiltration, you will be defamed and all the rest of it. This is the Saul Alinsky rules. You need to read Rules for Radicals if you want to get out of the algorithm. It's not a particularly good read, but just look at the 13 rules for radicals, and most people will know what they are, because the same techniques are used on mainstream news stations. So those awakened allowed themselves to be degenerated. This is what happened. And degenerated into non-specific. That's very important, into non-specific. So they would meet up in places, in big groups, and there would not be an intended outcome. So in other words, it was non-specific and ineffective action, which was pushed into deliberate cul-de-sacs. So things got worse, not better, but there is a choice. The starting point of any action must have an intended and well-defined outcome. Just repeating that again. I hope you're finding this useful, because sometimes, I don't know about you, but stating the obvious is actually really important sometimes, because it can be lost sight of. But I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I spend a lot of time thinking of ways around things. And I found that when I actually did try and achieve connection with the highest governing intelligence, or God, or higher intelligence than we are given in the material world, and mixing it together with concepts that would work, something else happens. It takes you out of the ordinary. And we've talked about the cult of mediocrity. Why do you think the cult of mediocrity exists? It's because mediocrity will never achieve greatness. What achieves greatness? Inspiration, something that goes beyond the everyday. In other words, something that is super normal, something that is above normal, something which goes into an area which cannot be controlled or defined. Now, that is where real change happens. And if those changes take place within the individual, then they can be used as the inspiration for group action. So the way I see things at the moment is that the the global predictors actually wanted this multipolar kind of front where people would all be appearing to do their own thing, but they're doing one thing. Now, how do you get out of that? Like I've just said, you have to break the pattern. And this is why I did a show called Manifesting Mediocrity, a Dummy's Guide, because pretty much everything I see now is mediocre. So I have to go and look up people who aren't mediocre to remind me that I don't have to watch the garbage which is being fed to me on a daily basis. So yes, another thing that's very important is that there's a huge lack of commitment now. There's a lack of integrity of knowledge and to knowledge. And in the absence of organization of knowledge into action, many just follow this information, which is of absolutely no value. Repetitive, reactive actions. Basically, a lot of people following cult leaders and cults. There's loads of cults now, internet cults, people spinning stories, spinning history, making themselves the center of the information when it's actually the information which should be the center of the information, not the person conveying it. The person conveying it is not important. They are merely a transmitter of information. Anyone who puts themselves higher than the transmitter of information and starts talking about themselves, me, myself, and I, all the rest of it, they need to be discarded, because the information they're putting out is secondary to the cult of personality they are trying to project. And that is a huge problem now. I remember the days when people like Eustace Mullins, I used to watch him. If you haven't heard of him, look him up. He did some tremendous work, and he could talk frankly, openly, clearly, concisely, and with incredible knowledge. And those are the sort of people that I really like. And there's a few and far between, but I don't see any on the internet now, not the ones who are promoted anyway. I see people who have good knowledge who get very few hits, but I don't see that organized into an integrated system of learning. That takes a lot of work, doesn't it? Which is really what I'm aiming for with these shows. Just to inspire those who listen to get into a more disciplined approach and have intended outcomes, and not like self-help, achieve your goals and all this crap. No, beyond that, way beyond that, because it's not about you. It's about the result of your actions. Two very different things there. So yes, people follow cult leaders, and these further remove their followers from higher intelligence. So what a cult does is it cuts you off from higher reality. That's the idea of the cult. That's the idea of the internet cult. The internet cult leader, the guru, who's telling you all about his view or her view of how things should be. Well, that's cutting you off from your own connection to higher intelligence. So that is thwarting your progress. And if you know anybody who's been in a cult, you'll know how their progress was terribly thwarted, and how these cults operate, because they operate in very, very simple ways. They just restrict the flow of information, give people many, many tasks to do, have a guru up front who basically doesn't answer questions, sends people off into allegorical nonsense, which is what a lot of the fake gurus do. In fact, I was thinking of inventing a character and having him on the radio show and using it as a sort of teaching device, because when you ask these gurus anything, they never give you a straight answer. There is never any rapid response of useful input or information. They take ages to answer and divert from what you said, and they go into banalities. And people accept this. So I think to keep away from internet cults is a very, very good idea. So it all comes down again to self-governance, the result of algorithm. So voluntary self-restriction of knowledge. What does that achieve? What does voluntary self-restriction of knowledge within an algorithm actually achieve? It achieves voluntary servitude. And that's what we see a lot, because some of these cult leaders, people mention them to me. I said, I don't join cults. And they get really offended as though it's not a cult that they've joined, when it clearly is. And that's the trick of the cult leader, isn't it? To make people feel special that they're not in a cult. So the mind must be unrestricted to function effectively outside the two lies, left or right, organized religion versus atheism, whichever ones you want. They always use these in debates on the mainstream TV. Outside the two lies or the egregorial cults and groups, which are just really steering mechanisms. And what we're talking about here is the retention of people actually in this pyramid. So the pyramid of knowledge, where you have the now self-assumed elite in the capstone of the pyramid, the administration and the yes men for the elite in the middle, and the uneducated serfs below. That's the way that these people are seen. But you often find in the uneducated so-called serf class, people know much more than in the higher up administration class, because they know more about the practicalities of the psychology of the way the elites are actually working. So that's just quite an interesting aside there. But yes, it's basically all about the dosage of knowledge relative to position in a pyramid. The elites claim all knowledge, but their knowledge has degenerated. So they can no longer claim the title of elite. So who's at the top of the pyramid? Well, global corporates and the people who we should have researched and know about are in that top of the pyramid. But there's also hundreds of thousands of people who we don't know about, who are actually much more powerful in the running of countries than the people up front. I mean, if you look at a country like North Korea, that's really being run by one family. And so when we talk about governance, we have to be flexible in what we're actually talking about, because when we talk about the West's global corporate governance, there are slight variations of that around the world, but they all interact at this high level. And what's happened is that it's just like a parasite class has taken over, and this parasite class is going nowhere. It's degenerating. And if you allow them to degenerate you, then you become their victim. And that's the key, not becoming the victim of the global parasite. And that can mean simple things like balancing the books yourself. In other words, if you are done some kind of injustice that you can do something about, there are ways of balancing the books even in their system. Sometimes these things are quite audacious. I've had many experiences of this sort of thing over the years. You do things which most people would actually be scared of doing, but you're doing it because you have foundation knowledge of the way their system actually works. So in a system of administration, there are always ways around things. And you find that in countries which have had a totalitarian governance system, the people always know their way around it. They'll always find a way around because there is always a way around. And that's the interesting thing. That's the inspiring thing, because who wants to become part of the cult of mediocrity? I don't, and I never have been. And I've always tried personally to excel at everything that I do. And that's just an aspiration to do the best you can rather than become this cult of mediocrity, because I think that's what's needed now. People who can step up, who are exceptional. And it's more exciting. Just a thought there. Yes. And we also get predictions, and these become steering mechanisms. Remember the age of Aquarius and the end of the Kali Yuga? Well, people make certain predictions about long-term cycles. And of course, these are easy to hijack for predicted outcomes. So the UN global governance system and the New Age governance system, which really came out of the 60s into the 70s with people like Robert Mueller, into the Common Core education, the whole New Age trip, which is the basis of the Gaia cult and the climate catastrophe cult. This is all New Age. And a lot of this was driven by this idea of an age of Aquarius. In other words, there was going to be this expansion of knowledge. Well, actually, it's worked the other way round. And people will say, well, yeah, but it's not time yet. It's not really started. But we're allowing people who use these long periods of time, 2,160 years, is it, or something, the Kali Yuga. So I've just been listening to someone who was actually saying it was 25,000 years or something. There's different versions of it. But I think the point is that it's down to the individual on a day-to-day basis. So this idea of a forthcoming golden age or a forthcoming apocalypse is actually a cop-out, because it stops you taking personal responsibility for your actions in the moment. So yes, so after the end times, what happens then? Because we do seem to be in the apocalypse. So that's the interesting thing to me, that this is something that can be experienced personally. So you're personally experiencing a massive change, but how are you going to adapt to it and advance civilization? That's the interesting bit, isn't it? Yes, and we talked of the end times and apocalypse as regenerative. Yes, this cycle of 2,160 years, all changes in the past were actually about governance, apart from things that were natural, like cataclysms. So in other words, everything is about governance and your response to it, apart from what we were talking about in the last show, which is the idea of a catastrophe. And we talked about catastrophism versus uniformitarianism. They want you to have, the educators want you to have a uniformitarian view, because it keeps you in the system where you're going to be happy with the mediocrity and the drudgery of the day-to-day existence, which they impose through this thought and belief system, which is nothing at all to do with reality. So overlaid onto these predicted changes are a series of cliches. And we did a show which was actually called Ascending to Nowhere. It was 5D consciousness, ascending to nowhere. And I actually picked out examples that I played of these people who were talking really, in a sense, about the communitarian system that had been imposed on them, but as though they were actually creating something themselves. Well, all they were creating was word salad and a bunch of cliches and a system which seemed to be run on astrology and talking to angels. Now, this is interesting because those are not systems of governance. Systems of governance can tie in to higher levels of consciousness, definitely. But when people spend their time going on about astrology as though it controls their lives, then they're in an egregorial cult group, because yes, these things do have an effect. I've had my astrological chart done, I've done all that. And what you have to do is balance these things which you've got in your personality. So you have to use things for the best and control the negative aspects. That's just a form of governance. So in other words, if you are addicted to astrology, then you're not governing yourself to override the system which influences you. So yeah, there might be bad days to do things, but it doesn't mean you can't get them done. And it shouldn't stop you with long-term planning. So all of this is quite interesting, and they were talking about sort of selections of cliches, and you hear this a lot, don't you? Consciousness shift. What does that actually mean? What do they mean by that? Does that mean going to some place and getting into group meditation and becoming programmed? What does it mean? You see, all of these things are open to interpretation. So it means that the globalist system just uses them to mentor you into what they want you to do. For instance, a lot of the Buddhist monasteries are there to push people into a certain direction. And the intelligence agencies, the CIA in the West, use a lot of these types of religions and Hinduism for Westerners to control groups, put them into cults, do experiments with them. That was all in the past. Now they know where they're going. It's this communitarian system. So consciousness shift means nothing on its own. It only means something if you have an outcome of what you actually want to achieve by opening your own consciousness. Now, that is a long process, and the easy way for Westerners was to get into group meditation and join cults. And that was why people like Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh were very, very popular. That's why you get these waffling time wasters, in my opinion, like Sadhguru and all these people who just state the obvious, but push you into the global goals as they're talking to their followers. They are pushing them into the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, and they're getting kind of rewarded for that. So consciousness shift on its own means nothing. There's another phrase, from me to we. Well, that's communitarianism, isn't it? That's the group being seen as the most important thing, and the individual having no rights, and everything comes from collective rights. In other words, the collective rights are imposed on the individual, but the collective rights aren't of the community. They're from the global prediction from above. In other words, it's a totalitarian top-down system masquerading as you, the community. The community is an imposition from above, which masquerades as something you have input or choice into. So rather than having a dictatorship, you have that. In many ways, a dictatorship's better because people know they're under a dictatorship. But with a communitarian system and the me to we kind of thing, people don't know. They have no idea that they're just fully infiltrated and they're being steered into the intended outcomes. Interconnectedness. That's another thing came up, like the Aquarian conspiracy and all this stuff. The Aquarian conspiracy, Marilyn Ferguson, 1980, very, very influential book. And that paved the way for other New Age classics like the Celestine prophecy. Basically, all of these are used to push people into certain mind groups. Interconnectedness. Yes, interconnectedness. Now, that can mean something very profound, or it could just mean the banal again, because people see interconnectedness as some form of community action. Well, community action is often and most likely steered. That's the communitarian system. Awakening. What does that mean? I wake up every day. But this word awakening is one of the most abused terms on the planet right now, because it's taken on this meaning that somehow these people have become enlightened. Well, I know a lot of people who say they are awake, who know nothing. In fact, they know less than nothing because they've been steered backwards in time to information that was no good 10 years ago, and they're using it in the present. And that is not progress. That is degeneration. New paradigm. Again, it's meaningless. It's like using the word change. What do all of the new governing politicians talk about? The C word, change, but they don't tell you what the change is. They promise you things, but they don't deliver. But the change is the communitarian change. 5D consciousness. Now, that one was hilarious. We did that show, Ascending to Nowhere. That's a funny one, because what they were talking about and what people I've heard talking about this, they're really talking about a form of narcissism and fantasy. And that's the opposite of really what consciousness should really be about. Quantum consciousness, of course, this idea that quantum physics somehow explained um, the the revelations, the awakening of the soul, and all this sort of stuff. Well, these are words that were just used by fake gurus from the 90s. Really, I mean, people like Deepak Chopra, quantum consciousness. What they did, they tried to mix up science with spirituality for Westerners, and it really ended up in this communitarianism. It ended up into collectiveness, collectivity, and it stopped any form of individuality or progress, in my opinion, because these words were used as steering mechanisms. Vibrational shift, that's another one, isn't it, that they use? Vibrational shift. I've heard a very popular conspiracy theory. So I started writing and there was a vibrational shift. Now, what about inspiration? What about something from the highest creator? No, the vibrational shift is used by people who think that they have created this shift within themselves, not the creator. So they are putting themselves alongside or above the creator or God, which is a degenerative form of system. Because if you look at the globalist system, that's what it's based on. And of course, we saw this with the Kabbalists, and we see this in the people who followed the Enlightenment, the Rosicrucians, etc. Where does this actually lead you? Where does this lead you? It doesn't, because they're putting themselves into an egregorial group which has been influenced by, yes, cults such as Kabbalah, which started in the Languedoc in the 1200s. And so all of this stuff gets mixed together into this soup of new age distractions which go everywhere. And all of a sudden, the real point has been missed, in my opinion. Done quite a lot of research on it. So it's good to try and explain it at least. And actually, do you know that manifesting was the word of the year in 2024? Manifesting, basically meaning getting what I want, getting what I want, me, me, me. That's what the manifesting thing was all about. It was all about people saying, I did this, I achieved my own success and all this stuff. But unless you are using higher intelligence, things like that are very short term. In other words, life is a lifelong learning project, and these things need to be refined. So talk of manifestation and all of these phrases, they've just been injected into the algorithm for you to use, regurgitate, and they can be used to steer you into pretty much anything. And it's all about context. So, yeah, that's quite a lot of information there, isn't it? Mm, yeah. Yes. So we've talked about that. I've gone through quite a lot of stuff. I do make notes for these shows because I like to stay on point. So all of this, what we're talking about, egregors and predicting outcomes through planetary alignments and stuff like that, and all this 5D consciousness that we covered in that show. Um, Basically, these things are just used to predict or control intended outcomes. And these sort of influences, as we've said, we are influenced by planetary alignments and stuff like that, but they are not the whole of governance. They are a contributing factor to influences within a governance system. So therefore they can be overridden. Just to reiterate that and clear that up. Yeah. So, yeah, we talked about that whole thing about this ascending to nowhere. And they were talking about a community empowerment process, pure communitarianism, citizens' assemblies, heart based unity consciousness, which basically equals the communitarian system. So, yes, all of this is part of the New Age global governance. So it's all overlaid into an imperfect information field for specific outcomes to collectivize and degenerate groups, basically and simply to bring them under control. So the global parasite knows this. If you believe change comes from outside without consideration and higher function, you can't change or move forward within this system. So the change has to be from knowledge which you accumulate. That's really, really important. And it's something that's been forgotten about, I think. Yes, all of these sort of books, like the law of attraction and all this stuff, all of this stuff was the basis for a steering into the communitarian system. So it's not just people who are part of the technocracy that get steered into it. There's a software element, which is the New Ages, and that was a massive thing. It's such a big cult and a big part of global governance. In fact, it's one of the most important things, and the mentoring centres for these people from Findhorn onwards, Findhorn in Scotland, that was the 70s, but they went all over the world, people like David Spangler and these gurus who took over. Yeah, Robert Mueller, who organized the Mind, Body and Spirit conferences. He organized the UN input into those, and the cult groups, which are all part of this UN system of governance. People, they're not discriminating here about what they are getting involved in. And that's the whole point of what we're talking about at the beginning, about the algorithm, not getting trapped in the algorithm. And the media chatter from all sides is repetitive, isn't it? And it's pointless. It goes nowhere. There is no outcome. Okay, so people who protest against the system, and then they go, yes, but we're all going to meet up in Whitehall and do the same thing again. But there's never an outcome. Incredible that we're at this level of degeneration. But so thinking outside the box, that's what's important, isn't it? It's to know what is in the box and who put it in there and for what purpose. Then and only then you can think outside the box. Because if you don't know the confines of the box, and some people think they actually do, but you need quite a lot of input and strategy and knowledge to actually achieve anything within the system at the moment. So, and then and only then can one escape these imposed confines. So rather than keep getting drawn back into the Groundhog Day, which is the stuff I get sent pretty much all the time, transcending that is the most important thing. And that's another thing, isn't it? Ascension and transcending. Well, used in the real meaning, which would mean that they actually go somewhere and you transcend the system. Well, that should be the goal, because I can actually say that it's worth doing after all the years of studying it. It's definitely worth doing because one can transcend a system which is imposing diktats onto you, which are neither tolerable or useful. So it's really about this discrimination. Discrimination is really important. And we hear from the World Economic Forum, the UN and the World Bank, they were telling us a few years ago to redefine our social contract. Well, what about redefining your social contract so that it stays outside their definition of what they want to refine you into? A contract with the creator is the highest contract. There is no higher contract than that. And that's a contract that many people have broken. And that is the contract that they want you to break. Because if you do not have that sort of power, that sort of ability, an ability for discretion, for being able to maneuver, to have divine inspiration, you're very easy to control. And that's the basis of most control systems. It's also the basis of how abusers and people who gaslight others operate. The same way. So if that system is gaslighting and abusing you, then you have every right to step outside of it. But to do this with discretion and not to openly react, which is what is built into that system, is the key. So to be able to define outcomes and have purpose. In other words, to see your way through something, you have to understand it and know what the obstacles actually are. And that is, I think, the greatest thing about living in fast changing and turbulent times such as these. Because, as I said at the beginning, there's an incredible amount of monotony within all this. And there is nothing clever going on. There is nothing that is very complicated going on. In fact, governance, the way that we are experiencing it at the moment, is incredibly simple. So the challenge is not that great. And this is what I've found to be the most inspiring part of it all, so that you do not get disillusioned. And this is what happens with a lot of people, isn't it? And they try something, but they don't really try it because they're trying within a template. So again, it comes to actually aspiring to excellence and thinking completely outside of the box which has been created, which is a very simple one. Yes, and we did a show called Pawns in Media, Fact Killers. And there's a quote there about information warfare, which is actually very relevant. Information warfare manipulates information trusted by targets without their awareness. Awareness is everything. And when you read or look at what someone is saying, or you hear what someone is saying, to have the awareness of what information warfare is paramount now, because pretty much everything is information warfare. Yes, it manipulates information trusted by targets without their awareness, so that the targets will make decisions against their interests, but in the interests of the one conducting information warfare. There you have the whole story of controlled protest. That's exactly what it is. And so what do we have? The media seems to dictate what most people think and say. We have the mainstream, which just works around the two lies, never the issue. The gatekeepers, who never address the issue but argue again over the two lies. We have the corporate alternative media, which again talks about the problem and focuses on personalities and focuses on group activities and focuses on exactly the same thing that all of its members focus on. In other words, it's a closed group. It's like a cult now. And it's grown and grown and grown. And basically, it's of no use or importance anymore, in my opinion, and from the stuff that I regularly get sent. And I don't listen to any of the sort of current commentators. I dig deeper than that now. And I think that's the point. You have to dig for information, and it is there. But the fourth category is quite interesting, because that's where you find specialized and useful information. And that is outside of the algorithm. So I hope you found some of this useful. The whole purpose of this is not for me to be on here just talking. I'm making statements which I'm hoping will be of use, a series of statements which will actually bring about thought processes. That's the whole purpose of this, to try something different. So we did a show called The Solution, and we gave the solution of many things that are global to local. And even though a lot of people looked at that, most of them did nothing. So you have to remember that there's only ever 2 or 3% of people in the area where they're going to have ability to actually create something different. And that is, to me, the most important thing, because I can't stand the monotony and the mediocrity anymore. I'm kind of looking outside it all the time. And of course, that means in many ways that you can spend a lot of time thinking or just experiencing higher levels of communication, which basically means not being around a lot of people because we have a lot of degenerate minds around. But the solution, so the solution appears when you know what the problem actually is. It is in your reaction to the problem which brings the solution. The solution is to reduce the consequence of impositions on your immediate environment. That is where it starts. So small things mean a hell of a lot. Small victories mean a hell of a lot. Small achievements mean a hell of a lot, because it means that you've not wasted your time listening to yet another internet waffler or guru, or joined another pointless group, or gone into, it's not that I do this, I don't have anything to do with these groups anymore, but I get people who contact me and say, join this group, join that group. Well, they're egregorial. They're talking about the same thing all the time, and they're being monitored and they've been infiltrated. You'd be better off talking to someone in the street than joining one of these groups. Yes, the solution is to avoid being drawn into energy draining affairs of no consequence. How much of what is going on and how much of what people get involved in is of any consequence whatsoever? Pretty much none of it. But imagine if there were intended outcomes and those outcomes were followed. Well, that's all the global predictors do, is they have a plan and they stick to it. They may have a lot of money and they may control the media, but it doesn't mean because you don't have the money and don't control the media that you can't execute a plan. All this to me is really interesting. So the solution is not in any mass movement, as they are all steered and controlled. That's the whole purpose of the times we're in. And we've done so much stuff on that. Look at an article called Agents of Revolution. Listen to some of those shows. And you'll kind of be surprised, I think, if you've not experienced this stuff before, how much is actually controlled and steered. Pretty much all of it. So the solution is not getting harvested, energy harvested is a thing, or controlled whilst having the knowledge of how things are working. So it's all about systems and finding out how things actually work. And the solution is knowing the real goals underneath the stated objectives, the real versus the stated goals. That's one of the most obvious things. And the solution is not looking for some big event or movement to change things for you. That is part, and probably the biggest part of the problem. Once you know how things work, the solution should appear if you have any first-hand knowledge of what you're actually dealing with or what you actually want and what is being imposed, why, and by who. Again, look at the real and the stated goals and the objectives that are being sought through your participation. So people say, what is the solution? It's from the mind of those who have become dependent on others for giving them a solution. So that's the point, really, that innovation is what's needed, I think. I think with all this mediocrity, about the cult of mediocrity, it's all about innovation and striving for excellence. As I've said in this, I'm trying to make that point because I think it's a good one. And the solution is hearing what you need to hear, not what you think you want to hear. It seems that the word solution means to most people a template which can be passed around to all. All this does, of course, is it facilitates mental laziness and acquiescence. So I'm going to be following these sort of concepts in future shows, along, of course, with all of the historical information and the backstories through history, which are useful. And that's the whole purpose of this. So I hope you enjoyed that. And I hope it's useful. The idea is that you can listen to it, even have it on in the background, and things might jump out and go, ah, yeah, that's a good idea, because I've collated this information over many years and it's really part of a lifelong learning project. So that is why I think that it's important to focus on actually what is important. So I'll leave it there. And thanks for the comments. I'm going to look at those now. And please do support the show because I want to put out a lot more information. I want to be working on more historical stuff and documentaries. So if you go to the homepage at Windows on the World or email me at info@windowsontheworld.net, you can join the £5 a month club, or support us, please do, because it helps to pay for stuff. And I'm also working on things for this new series, which we're going to be putting on YouTube, because now we can talk around the the narrative, the accepted corridor of opinion. We can talk around that and actually be clever. That's the whole idea, is that you go beyond the algorithm, which may be there just to shut you down. So thanks a lot, everybody. And I will just check the comments. I'll be back here again, 8 p.m. GMT next week. And do check out the website. It's all on there.